YouTube in a second. All right, welcome back. We are COMP397, that's web game programming, in the winter 2021 semester, and it's week 2, part 1 of our broadcast, and it's we're talking about character controllers and 3D tile sets today. I got a bit of a PowerPoint. Again, it's more from an organizational perspective than anything else, not really for teaching necessarily, but it's there for your reference. And I've got a lot of content already in the course shell, but I added a little bit more just for this. So last week, again, welcome back for those people who are here week 2. Last week, we kind of did a project overview, like which game are you making, which you should know. There's 3 types of games that we talked about last week: a platformer, runner, shooter, an isometric tower defense game, or a sandbox crafting survival game. And I indicated last week during my lecture that I recorded that platformer, runner, shooter is probably the easiest one if you're a non-gaming student. And even if you are a gaming student, I highly recommend, with the time that you have, that you can make a nice, tight, polished little game with your platformer, runner, shooter, and you don't have to challenge yourself beyond and to do these other games. They're there for people who really are there. There's always going to be a few that want people who want to push themselves, or they find that there's just, they're bored doing this, whatever. And that's why I provide those options, because I want to give you guys options. I think options are always good in general for students. So we talked about 3 types of games last week. We also talked about assignment 1, part 1. Assignment 1 was released, assignment 1, part 1, and that's due this Friday at midnight. So that is what was due. We also did group forming, and you're probably still in the stages, some of you, of group forming. There's probably some new people, some people that have left, and all that kind of stuff. So that is still probably going on until probably about Friday, probably until the last minute. And then I also sent you guys a Discord invite, which is going to be really boosting our group communication. So if you haven't had a chance to join Discord, the link for Discord is up on eCentennial. In the first week, it'll say Discord invite. Please join us on Discord. And then what I can do is, if you're on Discord, I can align you with COMP397. And I see more and more people are joining right now. Great thing about Discord is you'll find me more responsive on Discord than other platforms. Again, I don't respond to Teams too much. So if you're someone who's trying to find me on Teams, I'm there on eCentennial or Centennial, but I'm not really as responsive on Teams as I am on Discord, because I use Discord for practically everything. So that is what I recommend. Is it a mandatory? No, but I think it's good for you to do it. And of course, you can always reach me through regular channels, through email if you must. We also did a tools download and setup last week. We talked about downloading and installing Unity 2020.2 1F1 and Blender 2.91.2. We did that little setup last week, and we did a lab, Unity tour, and importing a simple object from Blender. And we also went over Git and GitHub with Gitkraken. So that way we kind of did that all last week. And most of you, I think almost 80 of you, submitted your lab that was due over the weekend, right? So Friday, Saturday. All right. So, and that's good. For the people that didn't, that's okay. There's 12 labs, and there's 10. You need to do at least 10 of them to get your 20%. So you still have a chance to catch up. For those people who did it, that's awesome. That means you're kind of on track, if you will, and that's a good thing, right? As we're going forward. What are we doing today? So this is this week. Assignment 1, part 1, again, is due Friday at midnight. So again, what we talked about last week was you need to get graphics assets, either acquire or create them. Okay, you need to get audio assets. You need to acquire or create them. You need to have UI assets, right? As an example, you need to have. Remember that there's no code that's required for this part. So there's no code that you need for this stuff. You need to put together your first draft of your game design document. I gave you a template last week, but that you could fill out. And what this first draft of your game design document is a plan for your game. What is your game about? Right, that kind of stuff. What kind of game are you making? What is the theme for your game? Example, if you made a platformer, runner, shooter, you can have different themes. You can have one that's in a dungeon. You can have one that's in some kind of sci-fi planetoid. You can have another one that's in the tunnels. You can have another one that's, maybe in space or somewhere like that, or another dimension. Whatever. There's lots of options here. One in the modern world. And you could also make your platformer runner shooter almost like a puzzle game, similar, or an adventure game, similar to other games you've seen in the past, right? So lots of options there. It's not just you're not just set in stone. Like everyone's going to make the same game. You have a lot of options, and there's a lot of leeway. All right, so that's that one. And you remember that in your first draft, your game design document, you're going to be talking about your mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. And mechanics, remember, are the rules of the game. Dynamics are how you win with the rules, like strategies. And aesthetics is the theme and how the game looks and feels to the player. All right, so that kind of stuff. Is it, more of an, an anime look and feel? Is it more of a retro look and feel? Is again, what kind of, is it more like a cyberpunkish or steampunk look and feel? What kind of, and this is going to help you with assigning assets. Like, where am I going to get assets? If I know what my aesthetics are, then I know what kind of assets I want to get, so that way it looks the same. We also talked last week about demo videos, that each of your assignment parts are going to require them. And again, just as a recap, only one team member needs to present. And basically all you're doing is narrating, or you're voiceovering your screencast. That's what you're really doing. But for this, in order for the demo video to be any good and for it to be accepted, your video must be good quality. That means the resolution must be crisp enough that I can see your screen, and your audio must be clearly heard. All right. As well, remember that no video, no marks. So if you hand in assignments and you get everything that's required, but you don't have a video, you get 0. I won't even mark it. Please, it's an academic integrity perspective requirement. So please make sure you submit this. It's mandatory. Okay, so that's something that I talked about last week. All right, and this week I'm going to talk about assignment 1, part 2, which is released and due week 4. So that's coming up, as well as I'm going to talk about specialty roles. What are they? I briefly talked about them last week. I talked about the game producer, the game designer, and lead software engineer. Those are the 3 I recommend. 1 for each person on a 3-man or 3-woman or 3 mixed person team. All right, as an example. And why is that? Because you need to align yourselves with at least these roles, and they should not be shared. Okay, I don't want you to be a producer, designer, engineer. Okay, that's bad. And if you're a person that's a group of 1, that is a terrible idea. And it's because there's a lot to do here. And like I talked about before, very little time to do it with this semester. And for you to do all these jobs, as you'll see, is suicide. So don't do it. Maybe not suicide, more like torture. Okay. And then we're going to be talking about Lab 2, which is today, which we're going to focus on creating a character controller and importing more stuff, another tile from Blender into Unity. In that, we're going to be talking about the anatomy of a script, so a little bit about scripting, the Unity order of execution, how the Unity lifecycle works, how does what about the update order or important classes, and input. How do you get input? Because you need to do, every game needs input. And every game, especially in 3D, needs some kind of physics interaction or collision detection. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. And that is the agenda for your lab. Next week, we're going to be talking about anatomy of light, shadows, skyboxes, and how to build from WebGL and deploy to your GitHub pages as a live page. So that's coming up next week with Lab 3. And again, if you look at our structure, we're sitting right here in week 2. And it clearly shows on our agenda where we are. Okay, so make sure that you follow along. Every time we get together with a PowerPoint, you can look at the PowerPoint and it tells you what's here, what's due, and all that kind of stuff that I'll be sharing with you. And then this is just further down in the semester. So before we go, are there any questions or concerns, group movements that you want me to make, all that kind of stuff? I do see that there are a few users on YouTube as well. I am broadcasting live on YouTube, like I said last week, because I want to support everybody as best as possible. So that's what's happening. Okay, so I'm just guessing that there's no questions. If there are, again, you can definitely raise your hand in the participants panel as an example. And the other option that you have is, that you could just, kind of type it in the chat if you have anything. As we go, I will ask you again, like last week, are you with me? That'll be like the cue for you to respond and say something like, yes, check mark, I'm good, or X, I'm no good, I'm behind, or whatever. And that's how it's going to be. All right, let me do a little bit of talking and then we'll start into the project. So I talked last week briefly about specialty roles for your project. And one thing I said was, hey, I want these 3 roles, one of the 3 roles for you to become. And I've kind of listed them here. I'm not going to go over all the details, but I think the most important thing is that I list them so you have them. So game producer, what is this person? A person who is more like a project manager. It's a really challenging role to be a game producer in your group of 3, which means you're really responsible for making sure that your submissions are all done. And notice that it says that all your submissions are required. I'm going to look at the game producer, whoever kind of decides that that's their role, for things like the game design document, all presentation files, zip archives, repository links, video links, all that stuff. There should be one person who at least is responsible for submission. And at least the game producer has that role, plus tracking the project and a bunch of other stuff. That's a game producer. Then the game designer, I mean, you can't really kick off a game without a game designer, right? So that's really super important. And the reason for this is because without a game designer, you don't have a game. So please make sure that you align somebody on your team with this. And again, they're really responsible for the story elements, what the game is about, and developing the game design document with the help of everyone else. So that's kind of the game designer's role. And then finally, the lead software engineer, which is everyone here in this program is a software person. That you all of you are coding. That's the expectation, right? But there's someone who's going to be in charge more than others about things like your GitHub repo and those kind of things. And I also mentioned Perforce because Perforce is also a competing version control system, a lot different than GitHub and used in the game development industry. But here at our college, we're doing GitHub. So like I said, that's why I'm putting GitHub down here first. But I'm also mentioning Perforce just in case you hear it on an interview or something. It's a different kind of way of doing version control. All right, so that is the lead software engineer. And if you have those 3 roles in your team, the little team of 3, I think you guys are going to be golden. I think you're going to be fine in terms of your production and all those kind of things. I think where the challenge is if you don't have clearly delineated like roles for everybody, and you're trying to step over each other, like everyone's doing everything, that's a bad idea. So so please make sure when you have your meetings with the people that you're going to meet with to get this stuff done, because part of the things you're going to be doing here in class, and there's going to be parts where you're going to get together with people outside of class to do this. To do your project, your assignment. So please make sure that you think about who's doing what. And don't say, Tom, we're mixing things up. I'm going to be the producer and the lead software engineer. Yeah, no, please don't do that. And if somehow your team has less than 3 people, which I think is a really bad idea, then, what I'd rather you do is one person should always be the producer, the one person that is the single point of contact for your team. And at the very minimum, the other person should be your game designer, right? So a team of 2. And the lead software engineer, notice they're put last because you guys will both share that responsibility, the lead software engineer. But that's the lowest I'd like you to go. I don't want you to be a team of 1, if possible. I have some other chat messages coming across. So Ibrahim says, so everyone does a little of everything, but there's always something someone specializes in. Yeah, but I would say not everything. Everyone codes. I think that's the right way to say it. And there should be some almost like a prime ship or, kind of a focus for everybody's, as a job so that everyone knows what they're doing. So, you know what? I'm a coder, but I'm also going to be game designer, right? That's my job, right? And you know what? I'm a coder, but I'm a specialty. I'm a lead software engineer. I'm going to come up with the styles and the standards for code. And I'm going to be, maybe I have a little bit more experience and maybe feel more comfortable coding. And so I'm going to take on the responsibility of making sure that our code looks good and everything works, as an example. But everyone should be a coder. That's number 1, because you guys, this is not a design program. And even though I'm talking about Blender and everything else, you're not designers or artists. You might be technical artists at the very most, but you guys are all coders. That's what your job is. Your entire job is to be an engineer, a software programmer, and then of course you have to specialize in one of those three roles. So that is the role. I also have another chat comment up here from Arthur that says, "Hey everyone, I'm looking for a group to join." Arthur, I think that's best to go on Discord, in my opinion, but because you're going to hit a wider audience than the 27 people that are here live on Zoom. Okay, so let's go to the next part. So let's talk about intro to scripting and a little bit and what that is. In order for us to start, I'm going to pull out the project that we worked on last day. So remember that last day, if I'm going to go up on GitHub for a second, and I asked those people who are with me to go up on GitHub as well. I think it's important. And if you go to Centennial College, right, then you're going to see that link that we're working with last week for your lab 1 was the last one I worked with was COMP397 W2021 lesson 1D. That was the one I did on Friday. Okay, so I want us not to start from scratch, but actually start from somewhere. So what I'd like you all to do at this point, if you're with me, is, and I'm going to do this for the entire week so far, is I want you to download this thing. So go there, go to COMP397 W2021 lesson 1D. Use this as your starter program, okay? And I want you to go and download the zip file. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to show you what this process looks like. So if I download the zip file, and again, what I'll do is for this one, I'm going to put this on our weekly start here. Under GitHub repos, you're going to see a thing called your starter. I want you to start with this one for lab 2 that we're working on today, and then end it off with some other one, another one. And we'll talk about how to do that right now. So again, I'm going to create a link, and it's going to say starter, right? Every time we're going to start off with a starter. There's going to be some kind of starter that you're going to have to download, right? Or whatever. Or you can keep going with what you had last week as an example. The challenge with that is you're going to have to do some of the work that I'm going to do with you here. All right. So it's going to say starter. So that's going to be up on your eCentennial. And it's going to be under this area called GitHub repos. You're going to see a starter. There's also another area called YouTube recordings where I'm showing my YouTube video right now. Okay. That's what we're doing. And there's also the PowerPoint slide deck that I've got here for you in PDF format that if you wanted to follow along in a different way. Okay, so that's all there for you to follow along if you need to follow along that way. Okay, so there's my starter, and I want to download the zip archive, right? That's what I want to do this time. So I download the zip archive. It's going to go probably on my downloads. That's where it's going to go. So I just downloaded it, and you should do the same thing. So in my downloads, I'm going to cut this thing and I'm going to put it on my desktop. And I'll show you this in one sec while I do that. So I'm going to go into my COMP397 desktop, and I'm going to put that in here like this. So here's COMP397. You can see that I got a few repos, and I've just downloaded my zip archive right here. All right, so this is from last week, and here's my lesson from this week. Now, I already have lesson 1D in here, and if I was to unzip it, you can see that it's going to say, where do I want it? It's going to extract to COMP397 W2021 lesson 1D main. And notice I'm also using something called 7-zip. I highly recommend using 7-zip over WinZip or something else, and you can download that for free. If you go to 7-zip, you put 7-zip on your browser and look for that, you can see that there is a download for this. And you can download the 64-bit version. What this does is it's better than the built-in Windows decompression software. I highly recommend doing something like this. As opposed to using Windows, you have less trouble going forward if you do this. So this is 7zip.org, and I'll put this as a link as another download, maybe in my course lecture. So I'll say in here, I'm going to do create a link, and I'll say 7-zip download. And again, I'll say optional, but I think it's a good one to download because it'll align you guys with in the same way. You'll see the same screens as you see for me. You'll see them here. So if you can grab that, download, and install it. And once you do, then when I go back to my operating system and I right-click, you'll see that I get a little context menu that says 7-zip. I definitely don't want to send to. Don't use this one. Okay, this one, when it says compressed folder or whatever, or decompress by using the extract up here, I highly recommend against that. You're going to have weird results. Windows is got a notoriously terrible decompression software that they use, and it messes up. So don't use that. Use something like 7-zip. And if I do that, and if I go extract to, so 7-zip, extract to, where it says main, then I've got this main repository here, and it's different than this one. Okay, so I'm going to keep this one for later on this week. But if you notice, if I go to 1D main, I can rename this thing. And if I look in there, you can see that I have my package that I had before. The git ignore is there. I have my assets, but notice I have no library folder because the library folder has been removed when we put it up on GitHub. So I'm going to rename this thing. So it's going to be, instead of lesson 1D, it's going to be lesson 2A, because you guys are the A team. I'll do another one on Friday for the people that I'm going to be live with on Friday. Remember, this week there are only 2 synchronous sessions, one today and one at Friday between 1:30 and 4:30. Okay, those are the 2 synchronous sessions this week. The rest are asynchronous, which means you do it on your own. I'm there for you, but you follow along with the video, the requirements, and if you have any issues during that time frame, I can meet with you or I can help you out via Discord or other ways. All right, so that is lesson 2A I've got in there, but I want to prepare because I know that I'm going to make this a repository. So immediately what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with Gitkraken. So I'm going to bring up Gitkraken. And again, I'm using Gitkraken. You can use whatever tool you want. You can use command line if you want. I'm going to use this because I find this is just easy to use for everyone. For me, I could do it with command line. I prefer command line, but I think it's more difficult for you. All right, so I want to make a new tab, right, as an example here in Gitkraken. And like I did before, I want to start a local repo right from the beginning. So start a local repo. I'm going to look in a particular folder. So notice my default folder it's looking in COMP397. This is nice. But I want to make my new folder, my new repository, COMP397 W2021 Lesson 2A. So I want to select that folder, and then in here, just make sure you name it properly. So COMP397 W2021, and then Lesson 2A. Someone asked me earlier last week, hey, what if I give you one big repo with every one of my labs? Please don't do that. That is a very bad idea. It'll make it a massive repo later on, and I'll have to keep on downloading it and all that kind of stuff. I don't need you to do that for me. Please, just one lab, one repo. One assignment part, one repo. Don't give me one big assignment repository for the entire semester. It's counterproductive for the way we're doing things here. Okay. Okay. Git ignore template I already have. I don't need to include it because it's already included in there. So this is one part I don't have to do. Normally I would just choose Unity, but I don't have to because I already have it. Okay. And I know that I do because it's already in lesson 2A. Okay. And that's it. Once I've done that, I click on create repository and we're done. Look at that. I've got my initial commit. I've got 44 unstaged files. I want to do my first commit. So I want to stage all my changes like I showed you last week. And I want to call this something like, I want to name this added project files. Again, this is kind of the second thing I do. First thing, I let Gitkraken make its initial commit, and then I add everything that I have to the projects. These are all the project files. And then I'm going to push it, but I don't have a remote. And you've seen this from last week as well. So I'm going to push this up. There's no remote. It says, would you like to make one? Yes, I do. And then if you give Gitkraken permission to manage your, no, you don't, Pablo. It already has it in there. And if you give Gitkraken a permission to manage your GitHub repo, then you should be able to do this and pull down your account. And once you've done that, or it's just there already, and then just create your repository and leave all the other settings as is. And if I click create remote and push, and if you've given the proper permissions to Gitkraken and all that kind of stuff, then it's going to give you a message that looks like this, view on GitHub. And what this is going to do is it's going to launch a link to your new GitHub repo called COMP397 W2021, and it's lesson 2A. But notice this, I have this README file that says W2021 lesson 1D. I want to modify it. Let's see what happens when someone modifies my stuff online. What happens? So I'm going to go in here online and I'll make this change this time around just to show you the difference. And I can move this to 2A. So this is 2A. Just all I've done is change the name of my online on GitHub. And further down, and I'm going to say commit all changes, commit changes. And what that's done actually is created another commit. I've got another commit online. And what's happened now is, take a look at this. I've got 3 commits online, but my problem is locally, when I go to GitHub, right, you can see that, or sorry, Gitkraken, you can see that, oh man, look at this. I'm behind. You can see that my local machine is actually, it's detected that my origin remote is actually ahead. Look at that. It's ahead of me by 1 commit. They're not in synchrony. All right. It's not synchronous at all. Right. And so what I can do is I can pull. This is the first time we're doing a pull, but I wanted to show you this. Once I pull, before I start everything off, then what ends up happening is I will synchronize these 2 things. Let's try this out. If I click pull, you can see now it says pull from where? Origin. And then when I do, boom, they're synchronous, and I have my new README file available to me. All it's done is update my README file from the one online. So you've seen now how I can pull and be kind of in sync again. All right, and you can see what happened. So GitHub is what where it was done, and that kind of thing. So that is, we're kind of in sync now compared to what I was before. Great. Now I want to launch my project, but guess what? In Unity Hub, I'm bringing up Unity Hub just like we did last week. Notice it's not listed here. Well, I have to add it. This is a new thing, and you're gonna have to do this pretty much every time we're together. So add, you're gonna choose the repository that I just added, which is 2A, and then click select folder. And what this does is it adds the new folder to your list here in Unity Hub, right? And now, if everything is correct, and my version is 2020.2.1F1, if you download my version and for whatever reason you decided, you made a decision to download another version of Unity other than mine, it'll say something like, your version doesn't match. Which version do you want to use? And you can select another version to open it up with. Again, highly recommend 2020.2.1F1 the entire semester, so we're on track. We're together on the stuff we're doing. But if you, for whatever reason, loaded something else, well, then you're going to have to deal with the results. Okay, it may work for you, it may not. Click on this. So when I click onto it, it'll bring up Unity for the first time. And now what it's doing is it's recreating the library folder that was created for us last time. All right, so it's recreating that folder. And the good thing about this recreation process is it's re-importing all of our assets that we made on Friday, right? And so that everything works properly in Unity again. Okay, that's what it's doing. So again, for the first time when we get together on the Monday, this is the first thing we'll do. We'll recreate our project, we'll have a starter, and then from there we'll go in and we'll make our new lab. Okay, remember that this project is going to be the lab that you're going to hand in for Friday and midnight. That's when the next one is due. All right, so, and now I come to this point and I have nothing in my scene. Why? Because when I loaded Unity for the first time, after I downloaded it from GitHub, notice my scene says untitled. It says untitled here, guys. This is not the scene that I'm looking for. I want to go into my scenes and double click on main. And now finally I have my entire scene back. Okay, now if mine loaded faster than yours, we talked about that last week. Chances are my system, my internet might be a little bit faster than yours. Are you with me? Do you have everything downloaded? Are you ready to go? With me here on, as you see here, if you're with me, check mark. If you're not, X, if somehow something didn't go right. All right. If you're watching and you're going to do it later, I mean, again, you have the entire week to get this done. But you know what? It's good to think about this as a one and done. You're here with me anyway. You might as well, do more stuff, right? So we're here together. Might as well. So are you with me? Check marks. I see 3 people that say yes. The rest, out of the 27 that are with me, 4, sorry, say yes, and no one else. That means that there's a lot of people. One person says no. Let's take a look at who said no, and I'll see if I can help them. Waleed, what is the issue, Waleed? Why couldn't you pull it up? Was there a problem with your machine? Was it a problem with your Unity? A problem with my files? What was it? Is 1.6F1 good for the project? No. I pulled it up, but nothing is loaded. That means you didn't extract it properly, really. It's not, if it's not loading, you have to extract it. You have to unzip it. Okay. Could be the invalid project path as well. All right, so again, I only have 4 of you following along, which isn't great. Hoping that most of you can do it. I'm gonna wait another 30 seconds, and I'm hoping to see more check marks. People are watching me that are doing it with me, as opposed to people that aren't, right? Because that's not a good thing. Please, guys, follow along as best as possible. Otherwise, what's gonna happen is I'm gonna do it, and you're gonna watch me, and then you're gonna have to do it again on your own anyway, and watch the video, which is, I don't think it's a great workflow. I think it's better to do it with me if you can. You don't have the title. Well, again, remember I went through into scenes, going to scenes, doyun, and then double click on main, and then hopefully you'll be able to see the tile in front of you like this. And doyun, can you see it when you double click in? If you click in scenes and going to main, double click in main, then you should be able to see this. Okay, there we go. All right, so now let's say a few of you got it. Hopefully you have. I'm going to move on, right? Again, if you haven't, remember that I'm going to continue to push this up on GitHub as we go. And the first thing that we saw here, the first thing that we see here in the console window is rebuilding library because the asset database could not be found. Well, it couldn't be found because we didn't have a library folder, and now it can. So this is our Unity. This is the tile that I made on Friday on Unity, or sorry, on Blender. All right, so, but what we have is in our prefabs, we don't have a prefab. Let's make this a prefab. That's the first thing we're going to learn how to do today. So here's our tile. I've got our tile in my scene. This is the one that you downloaded from GitHub if you're with me, right? And notice that there's inside of resources prefabs, it's empty, but I do have a model that's sitting here called tile inside of my assets model. So models are like raw models. Those are the things I'm going to download from Blender or Maya or whatever. And they're going to be asset files, but I'm not necessarily going to use everything that's in here, right? So again, you need to, I want to put this in prefabs. So I'm going to click on resources prefabs, and then I'm going to take this tile that's in the scene right now. Okay. Actually, let me take one step before we do that. Before I pull it in here, I want to talk about the properties of this tile. So notice on the right-hand side, we have a transform. And remember what I said, that all of our game objects, by default, the one component that all of them have is a transform component, which includes 3 vector 3 objects, a position, rotation, and scale. We talked about that last week, right? And it shows the scale as 8. Why? Because I scaled it up in a Blender and I didn't adjust for the scale. I'm going to show you how to fix this problem in Blender later today, okay? But that's what it is. And notice also the rotation is also -90. And I brought this in as a blend file, and I'm going to show you how it looks when we bring it in as a .fbx, which is another way of doing it, okay? So I've got my main camera, my directional light, and my tile. This is nice. And what I have also on the right-hand side is, if you notice in the inspector, I have a tag that says untagged and a layer that says default. I want to create a tag and a layer for the first time in my first tile. Again, this is inside of the inspector. I clicked on my tile before I make it into a prefab. I want to go into where it says untagged and pull this little pull down. And you notice there's some stuff that it has here already. None of this really makes any sense for us. We're going to click on add tag. And under the add tag method or area, we're going to add a new tag, and we're going to call this tag ground. Okay, so it's going to be tagged as ground. That's the first thing I want to do. I want to tag it as ground. And then once I've made the tag, doesn't mean that I've associated the tag with the tile. So I want to pull it down and select it now. So step 1, you make it. You add tag, and you make a tag called ground by pressing this little plus over here. And then step 2 is clicking back on it and selecting that tag, the one that we just made, ground. Once you've done that, then the tile itself is associated with the ground tag. All a tag is like a name, another way of naming. And you're going to see later how we're going to use this, so bear with me. The next thing we want to do is the same thing with layer. So ground, the tag and layer, I want them to be the same in this case, okay, just for this example. So again, I'm going to go into where it says default layer, and I'm going to go to add layer. And I want you to think about layers as physics layers, drawing layers, other things we're going to use layers for. So add a layer. Again, there's no more layer. We can add a layer in. We'll call this layer the ground layer. Press enter, and then go back to tile and select that layer again. So I'm going to select the ground layer. So now you should see tag, ground, layer, ground. If you don't know how to do that, again, all you need to do is go down here, add a tag, and then associate it with this. And the same thing goes with the other one. Now that I have this and it's a tile, it has a mesh collider. One thing that I'd like to do with the mesh collider is make it convex. So click on convex, please. Again, this is before, well, actually, let's not do that yet. We'll come back to this and I'll show you the difference. So let's leave it as is for now. And once I've got this, I can drag and drop the tile from my hierarchy into my prefabs folder. So again, resources is in the assets that I've made, the asset structure. I've got a resources folder that's an upper level folder. I want to go one in. There's a prefabs folder. Go in there and drag and drop this tile directly in there like so. When you drag and drop this tile anywhere actually in the Unity assets, you can always move it around. By the way, if you dropped it into the wrong folder, just drag and drop it somewhere else. For example, let's say I put it by accident in the assets folder and it's way out here or somewhere else. I can always drag it back into the prefabs. It's not a problem. Unity will adjust. All right. So notice it became blue. It became blue. Why is that? Because now my tile is something called a prefab. And I can pull in as many iterations. Take a look at this. I can pull another one in, right? I can pull in my tile multiple times, right? It's like an instance, right? That's what I'm doing. I'm pulling it in, and it's like an instance that I can put anywhere in my game world. Okay, I'm going to undo those changes. But I can make it I can add that tile in as many times as I want now, because it's a prefab. And a prefab for you is a prefabricated instance of an object. That's what I want you to think about. It's ready to be built and put into your scene. Okay. We configure a prefab. We save it inside the prefabs folder, and then I can use it over and over again. Think about enemies that are all the same, tiles that are all the same. Something like clouds that are all the same. Pickups, like let's say weapons that you might pick up that are all the same. You're going to pick up the same prefab every single time. You don't want to recreate them from scratch. You want there to be a pattern, and the pattern is the prefab, the instance of a class. All right, so that is the what prefabs do. So we've saved it. I want to save my scene now. So I'm going to go to File, Save, and File, Save Project. And now I'm ready to go with the next part of what we're doing today. All right, so we have a tile. We can, again, I can maneuver around it. Hopefully you guys got a 3-button mouse. And notice what I can do is, Walid asks, so prefabs can be considered as complete assets in a way? Yes. No, this isn't really textured or anything like that. And we'll talk about some more ways of making this nicer. But think about this as gray boxing, if you will. I've gray boxed, or I've blocked out one of the tiles that I want to use, let's say in my platformer. Your tiles maybe just like literally, would align with what you're doing a little bit easier. For me though, I pulled this tile in, I made it from Blender really quickly in 2 minutes, and I put this in. So for me, it's kind of somewhat complete. You're going to see that there's other levels of completeness, quote unquote, that I can make so that it's a little nicer than this. This is really bland. Okay. Okay. So again, all I see is this little tile, and I've got my thing. But one thing I don't have is a character that I can make run around on here. Once I've got my prefab, also one thing I can do is I can remove it. So if I delete my prefab, let's just go into the hierarchy here, not in your assets, but in the hierarchy. Think about this as like the live, tile that if I run the game, I'm going to see what the tile looks like, right? That is in my hierarchy, in my scene. I can get rid of it. I can just delete it, right? Because I have it here. I can always bring it back, right? It's not a big deal. And like I said, I can make duplicates of it, as many as I want. All right. So once I made my prefab, I can do this. I'm safe. I've got a pattern that I can bring in as many times as I want. Waleed says, like, let's say we textured it and it's polished. We can keep reusing it through prefabs for a platformer, for example. Absolutely, you got the right idea, Waleed. It's exactly what we would do. Textures, and you might also have a normal map that you want to use as well, which we'll talk about later. All right, so yeah, so here's my tile, and I have it here, but now I have nothing. Let's add in a temporary ground because I want to talk about controlling my character and input today, because we got to get going with this as soon as possible. So I'm going to right click here in my main, and I want to add a new 3D object called a plane. Again, I'm doing this in Unity, not in Blender this time around. And I want to rename my plane. I want to rename it to ground, because we're going to use this ground plane here as something that I want to play with, and add a character controller that runs around on the plane a little bit. We'll talk about what the character controller is. Notice it says untagged. We've already created tags for it. Let's make it so that it's the ground. It's tagged as a ground, and the default is also ground. All right, so the default layer. So layer and tag now are ground for this thing. And let's resize this thing numerically. So first of all, what I'd like you to do is notice by default it got placed in a random position in the game world. The position in the game world is at -6 something, -2 something, and -2 something. It got randomly placed in my game world. Okay. I can reset it to the 0, 0, 0 point by going to the ellipses here on my transform, going to the ellipses, and then choosing reset. And if I choose reset, then it shifts it to the 0, 0, 0 position. And then when I look at the game, you can see that I can clearly see the plane in my game view. So this is the edit screen. This is what the developers would see. And this is my game scene. This is what the player would see, like we talked about last time. Okay. So here we have it, and it's just a plane. And what I want to do is I want to make it a little bigger so I can run around in it, because I think it's right now it's 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. That's how wide. That's how kind of large it is. Actually, on the y-axis, which is up and down, notice the green arrow is up and down. There is no any thickness at all to it. In fact, if I look at it from underneath, you're going to see that you can't really see it. It's actually not drawing the back face, and that's what a lot of times we do with many of our game objects we bring into the world. We don't draw the back face because the users probably won't see it. I say probably because unless we have a weird error, and then they start seeing it. But for the most part, all we care about, and how I'm doing this, by the way, how I'm moving the stuff in the viewport is I'm pressing down on the middle mouse wheel and I'm pulling it down. I'm panning the scene. Again, super important to have a 3-button mouse, guys. And if I want to rotate or I want to orbit, I can use the right mouse button, and then I can keep holding the right mouse button down, and I can fly around, fly through with the WASD keys. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. If I want to see the object in the scene at the right angle, if you will. One thing to note is if I kind of come out a little bit, you can see that the camera is looking at the scene this way from the side. If I want to look from where the camera is looking, then I want to kind of go into the camera's perspective. So what I can do is I can fly over to the camera, turn around, and I can look and see what the camera sees. And notice now this is the preview down here in the right corner, and this is what the camera would see itself. And I can fly into the camera a little bit. So now I'm seeing what the camera sees. This is the plane the way the camera would see it. By the way, you can go up and down, like I said, with the E and Q keys. Okay. Again, I was just holding the right mouse button there. All right, so this is the plane that I'm going to play with. This is where I want my character controller to be on, but it's pretty small. It's 1 by 1 by 1. Let's increase the size by 8. So we'll say 8 by 8 by 8. And let's undo that change. I meant to do it on the plane, not the camera. So on the ground, I want to choose 8 by 8 by 8. So you can see it's much wider now. It's much bigger. The ground is much bigger than it was before. And I want to make it this big because if I make it this big and if I add a character to it, they can roam around here without the threat of falling off. Notice that the ground by default has something called a mesh collider on it, and we'll talk about what that is later on today, but that is what's on it. What is a collider? I want you to think about every game has a couple of things. It has every object has the ability to collide through physics, game physics, with every other object, okay? As long as they have a mesh collider on them. In this case, the plane has a mesh collider when I added it in. All right, let's save the scene. So Control S, so we're good. And now what I want to do is I want to talk about input, and I'm going to start off with adding a very simple cube, okay? Now this is not the final product, but I'm going to be talking about a lot of things here. So that's why I'm going to use it as a vehicle, right? A vehicle meaning a way of talking about this. So again, inside my inside my hierarchy, I'm going to add another object. I'm going to add, right click, or you can go to this plus, and I can add in a empty or a 3D object. Let me add a 3D object called a cube. There it is. And if you can't see it, it's because it's below the ground plane. Look at the position, the default that it put it in. 6.3 minus, and then something else, right? Let's reset it. So if we click reset, now you can see half the cube is in the 0, 0, 0 mark, okay? All I've done is put a cube in it, and I've reset it to 0, 0, 0. These are world coordinates. World coordinates. That means like this is in the game world. This is in the exact center or the origin of the entire world. But it looks like, if I zoom in, it looks like it's half inside of the world. Why? And the other half is underneath it. If I want to move it so that it's lying on top of the plane by default, then I have to position it up on the y-axis by 1. If I go to 1, I go above the y-axis. If I go to 0.5, 0.5, it's sitting right exactly on the plane, and you can see that the shadow helps us determine that. Okay, so that is the cube. I've moved it up 0.5 on the y-axis. Remember, the y-axis is up. The z-axis on Unity is forward or back, and the x-axis is side to side. Excellent. I want to differentiate my little cube from the rest of my world, so let's add a new material. And a material, think about it for now as just a color, the way the light hits the material, and I can associate materials with textures as well. But for now, all I want to do is I want to change the color of this thing so it looks green. Let's do that. Let's make a new material. So in my materials folder, we're going to go more into materials this semester. For now, I just want you to follow along. In my materials folder, I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new material. Here's my material. And let's call this material it's going to be our debug material. It's going to be the material we're going to use to debug the player. For now, we can call it the player material. We can also call it just a color like green, which is totally fine. All right. And the material itself, when I make it, so again, to make the material, I went into materials, I right clicked, and I went to create, and I went to material. That's what I've done. Okay. When I make a material and I click on it on the left, on the right, it has a bunch of information. One of them is something called the albedo or albedo. People pronounce this different ways, right? And what I want to do is there's a little color that shows white right now by default. I want to click on this little color, and I have instantly a color wheel pops up. I want to choose a green here on the wheel, and then move my little color to where it's going to be. So I want to move my color into the green area up here, like really like lime green. And notice there are some other colors here. You can always numerically make it pure green by changing the R, G, B, and A values. By the way, there's other color modes you have here as well. But I want to change the RGBA values to 0, 255 for green, 0 for blue, and 255 for alpha transparency for now. Okay, and then close it. So I've made the color green, but I want to associate it with my cube, which is going to be my player. And eventually we're going to change this up and it's going to be something else. The way I can do that is if I go to my cube now, click on my cube in the scene, and on the right, you can see that there is something called a mesh renderer, and there's a materials section. And right now it's using something called the default material, right? That's the material that gets created automatically by Unity when I make it. All objects have a default material. If it doesn't have a material, it looks like this. If I delete the material, it looks like this weird fuchsia color, right? And this, anytime you ever see an object in the game that looks like this, chances are there's no material for the object. Somehow it's been deleted, or you forgot to put a material on it or something. You need to associate a material with an object in order for us to see it and for it to render on the scene. Okay? So what I can do, because I have a material, I can go into my materials folder, right? I can click the cube again, and I can drag and drop it from my materials folder into that little slot. We're going to do a lot of drag and dropping, and there's no code here again. All I'm going to do is take my green and just drag and drop it. And now my cube is green. All right. So if you've done what I've done in one way or another, and your cube is green, and you have a cube that's sitting in the 0, 0, 0 position with 0.5 up on the ground plane right now, if you've done that, I want you to put a check mark if you're with me and an X if you're not in Unity. So I want to know that you're with me. I'm going really slow here, guys, believe it or not. And if I'm not, if it's too fast for you, that means that, again, it's just practice. You haven't used Unity for a while, or you're new to Unity and all this kind of stuff. So I see 6 people this time around have the green cube with me here. Again, this green cube is going to go away. I'm just making it for us so that way we have something to talk about and we can control something in the scene. Talk about controls right now. Thanks, guys, for that feedback. All right, so now that the green cube is there, I want to rename it. Right now it's called cube, and that doesn't make any sense. Let's just call this cube player. We're going to fix this again later on. So here's my player. And notice that there's a couple of components that come with the cube. It comes with a transform, and it also has something called a mesh filter. And look at the mesh filter by now. For the cube itself, it has a cube mesh filter. This is think about this as the mesh from Blender. I can always swap out this mesh for something else. So example, right now it's a cube, but if I wanted to make it a sphere, I can click on the little target. Follow me here. I can click on the little target, and I can choose some other primitives like sphere, and now it's a sphere. Or I can make it a cylinder or a capsule. The problem with this is the collider that was originally chosen, which is a box collider. You can see that there's a little bit of an outline there of a box. That was made to associate with a cube, not a cylinder or a capsule. And that's why it looks weird. And that's why if I was going to make it a capsule, by default, then I would use instead of a box collider, I would use a capsule collider. All right. For now, let's shift back to a cube because that's all I want to. I'm going to go back to where it says mesh filter and choose cube. Back to that. All right. Why am I showing you this? Because there's a lot of quick ways to change the way your object looks by just choosing another object to associate with it. Think about a mesh as something that I can reuse with different coordinates. And all I'm doing is re-imaging or re-instancing another cube wherever I want it. All right. Okay, lighting. Here's the next one. Materials is, we talked about before, the material is kind of like a color for now, the color of when the light hits this, how this thing looks, right? As an example, it could also, materials could also indicate an image that's wrapped around the object to make it look cool. And then we'll talk about that more next week. And lighting, do I want it to cast shadows or not? For now, it's casting shadows. If I turn this off, you can see now it doesn't cast shadows, but then it doesn't look right. Something looks like, it almost looks like it's floating if I don't cast shadows. So for now, let's turn shadows back on. All right, that's what casting shadows does. I can also receive shadows, but if I don't want to, I can check this off. So if I have another object and it was casting a shadow on this object, then receiving shadows would be okay. For now, let's leave everything on. Here is my box collider. My box collider was automatically generated when I make my cube. And I want you to think of a box collider as bounding area, a bounding area that basically is logical, that allows me to create a physics contact, if you will, or overlap cube with something else. So if you notice, if I click on this little edit collider, I have the option of changing the size of my collider, even if to make it even bigger than the actual object, or change it in size. So this is the bounding area now, as an example. Let's undo that change. I don't care to make that different. And if you ever have a problem with the mesh collider or the collider that's around this, you can always go back and numerically set these things back to where they were. All right, so that is my little player cube. That's all it is, right? I want to be able to move this around. And now, for the first time, we're going to be talking about scripting. And we're going to be talking about scripting for most of the time here in this semester because you guys are programmers. and you don't want to watch me drag and drop objects on the screen. You want to do some scripts, right, with C# and so on. And I'm going to show you how to do them right now. So I'm going to go to scripts in my scripts folder, and I'm going to add 2 scripts, and we're going to modify these scripts heavily. The first script I'm going to add in is called player behavior. Let's add that new script. So I'm going to go right click in my script, right click and go to create C# script. Okay, so again, I've right clicked. That's one way of doing it, and then create C# script. The other way is you're inside of your folder and you can click this little button and click C# script. All right, this little plus button, whatever's easier for you. All right, again, I'm going to right click and go create C# script, and then I want to name it, and the name should be something that it's affecting. For here, I'm going to affect the player's behavior, right? So I can call it player behavior, and I'm spelling it the English way or Canadian way, not the American way. And then press enter. And what it does, notice it gives you a bit of a preview of what the script looks like right here. Okay, that's the first script. Let's make another one called the camera controller. So I'm going to right click, and I want to make a new C# script called the camera controller. All right, so I have 2 scripts, camera controller and player behavior, 2 different scripts altogether, right? But they're not associated with any object. I can have as many scripts as I want, but until I associate them with an object, they're useless. They're not being used. Let's just put it that way. So right now I have a player object, and notice that it says also add component. Another way to add a script is click on add component. And if I type in script, you can see I can add a new script, right? Make it whatever I want. Or I can add a script that already exists if I type in the name of the script that I've added. So for example, if I want to add a player behavior script, which I will, you can see that the player behavior script comes up, player behavior, and it separates it. Look, player behavior. So that's what I want. I want to associate this script with the player, and there's another way to do it. You can also drag and drop it. If I drag and drop it over the add component button, it also gives you a different symbol. Look, can't drag and drop it here, but if I drag and drop it, so close this up again. If I drag and drop it over the actual button, like here, you can see that my cursor changes to this, what looks like an arrow, right? This indicates that I can drag and drop or associate a script on top of another object. So there's 3 ways I showed you how to do it. And there's actually another way. I can also drag the script on top of my object in the scene too. I can do that too. So there's like 3 ways. I can also drag it on top of the player inside the hierarchy, right? Once I drag my script on top of the player in the hierarchy, in the scene, on the button, or if I press add component and find the script, I have a connection between my script and the object, the game object. So let's do that. I'm going to do it like this. And once I have that, you can see that now my script player behavior is attached to my object. Okay, good. Are you with me? Check mark if you're with me. You've made a brand new player behavior script. It doesn't do anything right now, but it's attached to my player object. I got 3 people that say they're with me and that are watching. 4. Now, I've also, while you guys are letting me know what's happening, I've also talked about scripts on the PowerPoint for you here. And what we're going to get is a script that gives us, it's really a class. You're going to get a class, a public class. Let's say I call it player behavior, and it's going to inherit from another class, a superclass called mono behavior. Mono behavior is the default class that comes with Unity. It's a Unity specific class. As an example, and this structure might seem familiar to you in some ways. If you've done C# programming in the past, most of you have, and you can see that there's a curly brace here and a curly brace here, and there's 2 functions that come with our player behavior script. One of them is called start, and the other one is called update, and we'll talk about what those are in a second. Let's go back to Unity. Here's Unity, and I've got my player behavior script, and sure enough, I have a little preview over here that you can't modify, right? That shows you the preview of what my script is. Okay, I want to modify my script. Now, for me, because I'm using Visual Studio, when I double click, one way to get the script going is to double click the script here in the assets. And when I do, it's going to pull up or start the associated program for scripting. Now, I've left it with Visual Studio, but you can certainly choose other programs like Visual Studio Code and others. I'm going to try this with Visual Studio. So I'm just going to double click the script. When I do, you're going to see Visual Studio pop up, and it's going to take me into the solution, but it's not going to look like a regular solution. Notice it says Assembly C#. That's the solution, and the project is Assembly C#. That is different than what we've seen in the past. And if I kind of scroll into Assets, Scripts, you're going to see that I have two scripts that I've made: Camera Controller and Player Behavior. Those are the two scripts that I have here. What I'm looking for is the Player Behavior script, which is right here. All right. So Player Behavior right now is attached to the player. And one of the things we want to do with scripts that are attached to the player, well, that means, Kevin, that you haven't associated a Visual Studio with it. Kevin says that he double clicks and opens the notepad. That's bad. For it to open in a Visual Studio, sorry, just to go back there, if you go to Edit, and if you go to Preferences, Edit Preferences, you're going to see something called External Tools on Edit Preferences. And notice on the right, I've associated my external script editor as Visual Studio Enterprise, right? On the right. Okay, so Visual Studio Enterprise. You can also choose Visual Studio Code or something else. So maybe yours doesn't have an association here, Kevin. So make sure you choose something else, okay? And I also got another thing that says My Solution Explorer shows 0 projects. Yeah, well, there's not really a project here, but you have to double click on your, it might take a second, but you want to double click on your script and it should come up. If not, again, you can choose, just like I showed Kevin, another IDE that you're going to use. I'm just using this as an editor. It's not going to be used as a full-fledged IDE like we normally do. It's just an editor, and it's going to have some debugging that's built in, so it can associate itself with Unity. The Unity debugger has been added, okay? And by the way, if Unity has not been added as a debugger, remember, you can always go to Extensions, and let's take a look at Manage Extensions in Visual Studio. And if I type in Unity, right, then you will see a lot of times, if I have the Unity debugger, if there's something that's associated with it, if I go to there's updates. Okay, there's updates as well as installed. If I click on install and start typing Unity, a lot of times we have a little thing here where it says Visual Studio Tools for Unity that's already been pre-installed. If you don't have this as installed, you could install it by going into the Visual Studio installer and adding Unity, the Visual Studio 2019 tools for Unity. If you do, then it's going to give you great feedback and support here in Visual Studio. This is your environment. And the way to do that is to go to your window button and type in Visual Studio Installer, this one, Visual Studio Installer, which is going to bring up your Visual Studio installation. And what it's going to do, it may need to update. A lot of times it does this where it says Update Visual Studio Installer. That's fine. It won't take a second usually to update it. And if it does, what it does, just updating the installer itself so they can associate itself with other, installations. Okay, again, notice that the downloading didn't take too long. The installation might take a second, but all this is going to do is basically update the installer to give you options of what things you can install for Visual Studio. All right, so if you need to do that, it's totally fine. It says checking for updates, and it says, hey, there's an update available. I could accept the update. I'm not going to do that now because I'm live. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to More. And what I want to do is I want to, instead of updating it, I want to modify it. So I'm going to click Modify. And if I modify it, it's going to show this large array of installation options. And what I want to see is this one place that says Gaming, where game development with Unity is checked. You need to have this checked under Gaming. If you don't, and if it doesn't even appear here, then you can go into individual components. And then if you search for Unity, right, you can see that there are two things that gets installed. One is Unity Hub. You should have that already. But the other one is this one, which is really key, Visual Studio Tools for Unity. And again, if you don't have this installed somehow in Visual Studio, you're not going to get good code hinting. I recommend you do this offline, not now with us, because it's going to take some time to install this component, okay? But that's how you would do it for Unity. All right, so I've got Unity and I've got this, and I want to start thinking about how to control stuff. Well, in our little PowerPoint, I talked about input, right? So I said, hey, you know, one of the things, well, actually I talked about a bunch of stuff. One is the script. The other one is there's something called the order of execution or execution order. And there are several lifecycle functions that are built into Unity that we're going to tap into as part of the Unity application programming interface. By the way, I've given you a reference here for the manual execution order for if you wanted to take a look at this on the Unity website, which is where I got this documentation for you. All right. So notice that there's initialization on awake and enable. Then there's more initialization in a function called start. And again, we're seeing that function right here. This is where initialization takes place in the start function. Think about this replacing the constructor in C#. We don't normally use the constructor in a class that is of type mono behavior. We're not doing that. What we typically do is we use the start function for any initialization for each of the scripts we put in our object, okay, or attached to our object. The other one is update, and this is where the game, this is the game loop where it updates. Anything that you put in the update function, it's going to get called every frame, like it says here, once per frame. And once per frame means, if you think about it, we're trying to run things at 60 frames per second. For people who don't know this and they're non-gamers, it's 60 times per second, 60 times per second. And 60 times per second is once every 16.66 milliseconds. So this is like once every 16.6666 non-terminating repeating milliseconds. It's going to update. It's going to call this function. And every script that has an update, you put something in there, any kind of code in there, it's going to be called once every 16.666 milliseconds. And if you forgot what a second is, there are 1,000 milliseconds for each second for those people who forgot, right? Because maybe you're not a gamer and you don't think about these things. So you got to think about every 16 milliseconds, there's 1,000 milliseconds for each second. And I'm going to run I'm going to update, if I run every 16 milliseconds, approximately updates 60 times per second, which is really what we call 60 frames per second or 60 FPS. Okay, that's the default kind of, you can set it to go faster and frame limit it and all that kind of stuff, but that's pretty much around what Unity targets. 60 frames per second, okay? So that is the update function, okay? So that's what it says here. It kind of goes through, and then there's a bunch of other updates. There's another update called fixed update, and I want you to also always associate fixed update with physics. So just, it sounds like the F sound, fixed physics. That's why you would use fixed update for physics actions. And then there's another update called late update, and late update, it's used later on in the game logic area after the update. So there goes, look at this, it goes fixed update, update, and then late update. Those are different kinds of updates. We're going to be using mostly the regular update that we see here and the fixed update that we saw earlier. Then there's some kind of scene rendering. There's a bunch of little lifecycle functions that make the scene draw on the screen. And then draw some gizmos. Gizmos in Unity, by the way, are things like this little object here, and the gizmo that shows us the camera position, this gizmo up here, and anything else that's inside the editor. All right, that's gizmos. Okay, so that's draw gizmos. And then finally, it does UI rendering. So the editor gets rendered, as well as the rest, decommissioning, on disable, and so on. So this is the whole life cycle, if you will, of the entire of Unity's frame. Every frame, 60 frames per second, it pretty much goes through this entire life cycle over and over again. Okay, and notice it kind of goes back up and loops back up here, back up to the top, and then it repeats every frame. Okay, so this is what happens. All these functions get called. Once you associate an object, you know, a script. If you associate a script here, I'm just going to pull this up again. with mono behavior, it subscribes to that behavior that we just saw, start, and then here's update. It gives you start and update for free right away, and then you can add to it or remove these functions if you don't need them. All right, so that's how it works. So what I want to do now is I want to move it around, and when we get input, if I go back to the input area, one thing that it talks about an update order, by the way, and a bunch of important classes that I talk about here in the PowerPoint. This is for your reference. Again, this is taken from online for you. I pulled it in here so you don't have to look all over the place for it. But input is what we're going to do next. And when we do input, Unity allows you to tap into different devices, keyboards and mice, joysticks, controllers, touchscreens, accelerometers and gyroscopes, VR and AR controllers and devices. It allows all kinds of input because Unity is made so that way you can get input from different devices from now and into the future. All right. So the way it does input is there's something called an input manager, and you can find the input manager by going to Edit, Project Settings. So if I go back to Unity, and if I go to Edit, Project Settings, right, then you can see that if I click on the input manager, which is right here, there's an area here called axes. These are all the axes of a typical input manager. I can make more of them, but by default, you have one set of axes for one controller or one set of inputs. That's what the input manager is. And this is, by the way, is a legacy package that's being used by Unity. Where they're in the process of moving to something called the new input system, which is different than the input manager, which is more abstract than this. But for beginners, I find that the input manager is just fine, and it's going to still be supported into 2021. Okay, so input manager is the way we're doing it. Notice that there's several axes. So one of them is the horizontal axis. The horizontal axis is just a named axis that we're going to tap into. So the name is horizontal. The negative button is the left arrow. The positive button is the right arrow. So if I want to move horizontally, I can either use the left arrow or the right arrow, the A button or the D button, or I can use some kind of controller, all right, to help me do that as well, okay? So that's what the horizontal is. Horizontal gives you a set of buttons that allow you to do horizontal movement, okay? Now, again, you don't have to use these buttons. You can use each individual button as well, but it gives you something that's cross-platform compatible. Same thing with vertical. Vertical, it gives you up and down arrows for moving forward and back, or the S and W keys on your keyboard. So again, you can use WASD, you can create a WASD movement scheme by using horizontal and vertical inputs, okay? Notice also there's fire 1, fire 2, which is the left mouse button. There's also jump, there's mouse X and mouse Y, so different kinds of inputs that are here as well, okay? Today we're gonna care about the horizontal and vertical inputs. The jump input, chances are mouse X and mouse Y. We're going to use all these things in our input manager. So why am I showing you this? Because this relates to code. What you see here is how we're going to, add code to connect to our input. Let's close this up. This is just information. All right, so going back to this then, I want to get my input, and I want to do it every frame. So every frame, I'm going to say something that looks like this. Let's just try this out and see what happens. I'm going to say that if, and here's one way of doing it. We're going to show you a different way of doing it by the end. If input, you can see I'm calling the input class, and this is our first script we're writing together. If input dot, and then you can see that there's get access, and there's two. There's get access and get access raw. Get access is a smooth access between 0 and 1, and 0 and -1, where 0 to 1 is positive movement, and 0 -1 is negative movement. Get access raw goes from 0 to 1, and there's nothing in between. It's not smooth at all. So this is get access raw. Let's use this one for this time around. So non-smooth movement. Now it asks me for the axis name. We're going to use horizontal, exactly how you saw it inside the input manager. Notice that I'm getting an error because I haven't completed my code completion is telling me something's wrong, okay? And then I want to say, if my horizontal axis gives me a value that's greater than 0, right? That means it's more than 0, more than the dead zone, right? Then what I want to do is I want to say that I want to move to the right, okay? And similarly, if I did it the other way around, like so, then I want to move to the left. Let's do a debug so we can see what those look like. So here, I'm going to put the first debug we're going to do in the actual console. It's going to be debug.log, and we're going to say moving right. This is like a console.writeLine equivalent. And then we'll do a debug.log, and we'll say moving left. I just want to get some input, guys. That's all I want to do right now. All right. So again, in my update function of my player behavior, which my player behavior is attached to my game object. You won't get any input at all unless this is attached to my game object. Even if it's a script that I made and it's in my assets, unless it's attached to my game object, you will get 0 input. Okay. So I'm going to save this script. I'm not going to run it here. Okay. What I'm going to do instead is go back to Unity. You're going to see this quick compilation step as it compiles my code and displays the preview inside of the inspector when I'm clicking on my player behavior. Now, when I run my scene, if I run it, and if I press my A and D key, you can see that the cube is here. And look it down here in the console before I start pressing the keys. If I press my D key, then what I'm expecting is I should get some movement right. And if I press my A key, I should get movement left. Similarly, if I press my right arrow, I'm going to get movement right. And I press my left arrow, I'm going to get movement left. Okay, again, are you with me? Check mark if you're with me and your code works. X if somehow that completely failed and you can't get any input whatsoever. Again, this is our first script we've written, and all we're doing is debugging. We're not even doing anything yet. I got 2 yeses and 2 nos, okay? Gerwinder, talk to me about why you're getting nothing or something is not working. Can you help me out? And Franz asks, how do I access the input manager again? It's just for looking, Franz. I'm not actually doing anything with it. To access it, you want to go to Edit Project Settings. And then you can, on the left, there's a big long list. All you want to look at is Input Manager, and then you can see all the names, horizontal, vertical, and so on. You need to spell them the exact same way, though, okay? And then you can change these keys up if you don't like the keys that are there. All right, so Gerwinder, talk to me. Why is it that your script isn't working? Let me check my coding. Okay, and the other person I have that's also a no is I have Ramandeep. Ramandeep, you also show a no on your script. Can you tell me why that's not working for you? Again, I'm just going to be mindful of the time because we have lots of stuff to do and a little bit of time to do it. So Ramandeep, oh yeah, you're good now. Okay, good. So I've got a couple of people here. And I've got one person, Gerwinder, still, we're waiting for you. All right, good to go now. Excellent. Okay, so we got everyone on. Lushy says, Professor, I lost you when I was trying to fix the visual code as a default editor. No problem. So let me bring up my Visual Studio Code, and you should be able to see the what the script looks like right now. So this is what the script looks like at this point. Okay, so again, not much in there. So greater than, remember what get access is going to return. If I hover over get access, my Visual Studio installation is going to tell me what it does. It returns the value of the virtual access identified by whatever the access name. In this case, because we're using get access raw, there's no smoothing. Either it's on or off. Okay, that's what that's showing. And this gives us a value, the access, depending on the button we pressed, between -1 and 1. That's the value we're going to get, where 1 is all the way to the right and -1 is all the way to the left. If I'm using a gamepad, I'm going to get -1 if I press left, the left stick. And if I press the right stick, I'm going to get +1, -1 to 1. That's what's going to happen. Instant, no smoothing. It's just raw input. That's what I'm getting right now. All right. So this is good, but I want to do something with the cube. All right. And the cube, let's go back to the cube now for a second. The cube is sitting there innocent-like, right? And this is my scene. I'm going to stop my scene for a second. Here's my cube. And I want it to move. Now, there's a couple ways to move things. I could reposition it. I could say that, you know what, whenever I press the my button, my right button, I'm actually going to reposition the cube plus 1 pixel to the right, or X number of units, if you will. And one thing to note is if you look at Unity, if I pull back, you can see a grid here in Unity. And each of these squares that you see are 1 meter by 1 meter square equivalent. Okay. Actually, if you kind of pull out. So that's what this is. It's about 1 meter or 1 unit, if you will, 1 unity unit. Okay, 1 unity unit. So if I go 1 unit, I'm going to go whoop, way over there, right? Like it's going to increase by 1 unit a frame, if you will. That's what's going to happen. 1 unity unit. So what I want to do then is if I can reposition it, and you can see that the player right now is at 0 and 0.5. So what I'm going to try and do is I can change the x-axis, the value on the x-axis, so it traverses to the right. But what I'd rather do is I want to push it over to the right with physics, because we're in 3D and I want physics to work on our game because we're making a platformer, right? So in order for me to make physics work, I'm going to add to my player something called a rigid body. All right, so I'm going to make a new component here, add new component. And instead of making it a script, we're going to call it rigid body. All right, we can search for it, rigid body. By the way, instead of putting the search in there, the other thing you can do is you can go down to physics and just select rigid body. Either way, you want a rigid body to be added to your player object. Now, notice that the rigid body is underneath the player behavior script, and I don't really like that. And what you can do, as long as the object is not a prefab, it's not already a prefab, which my player is not, I can move these components around to make myself feel more comfortable. It doesn't really matter the order, but what I can do is, again, Kevin, if you want to add a rigid body, you just go to add component and you can go to physics and go to rigid body, or in the search area here, you can just type in rigid body and then click onto it. Okay. So when I add a rigid body, I can move this up if I want. So on the right, you see there's an ellipses, and I can just go move up. Again, looking at the rigid body component right here, I've just minimized it. I can go to the ellipses and click move up. And what this does is it makes the rigid body, and by the way, I can collapse all these three things for as well, because I don't need all this information right now. So I can just collapse it so it looks kind of a little tighter. All I've done is I move this a little bit wider so we can see this wider, but you can control that. And what you can see is a rigid body that looks like this. A rigid body basically allows an object to work with physics. Once I've attached a rigid body to my object, it will fall automatically to the ground or fall down with physics as soon as I put on kind of a rigid body onto it. And to show you this, if I lift this object into the air by default, let's say, for example, I move it so that it starts off at, let's say, 5 units above the ground. You can see that it's physically off the ground plane. If I start my scene, then what we'll see is it'll just fall down. And it'll do that automatically because as soon as I attach a rigid body to it, then Unity's physics, basic physics, take hold, and then it falls down at 10 meters per second, approximately 9.8 meters per second squared, just like physics would work in the real world. Now, it looks a little floaty to me, and we'll change that later on. But for the most part, that's what happens when you add physics, rigid body. But if I'm adding physics, I don't want to be able to reposition an object. I want to push the object to the right or push the object to the left with force. I want to use forces, which is the right way to do things, right? So because I want to add forces with my rigid body, then I'm going to go back to my script now. So again, I've got a rigid body, right? And I want to go back to my script. So in my rigid body, I have no idea. Because this is a generic script, it doesn't know that the player has a rigid body attached to it. But what I can do is I can create a rigid body component. Let's do that together. So whenever I add a property to a class here and if it's of type mono behavior, what I get, just to let you guys know, what I get is any object that I make public will make itself available for the most part to the inspector. So that means I can see it here in the editor. Right now, there's nothing in my player behavior script that I can see. But if I add public in front of it like this, right? And then let's say, for example, I want to make an object called like movement force. I want to add movement force as a property. So I can say public float, and I can call this movement force. Notice my my convention is camel case, right? If I called something movement force and it's public, then when I go back to Unity, you can see that movement force now becomes an object that I can modify in the inspector. It becomes a value that I can put here. Let's put a value of movement force of 5. That means 5 units of movement force every time we do something with my object, okay? So again, all I did was I went to my script, and at the top on line 7 approximately, I put a new public float, and I called it movement force. By the way, back in COMP 100 or COMP 123, one thing we talked about was public properties and private instance variables. This is a public instance variable. So again, there's other ways of making this private and still exposing it to the inspector. For now, though, let's make it public just so we can get through this today. All right, so it's public. We made it, and we added a value here in the inspector of 5. That's the default value. Cool. So now that I have this movement force, I want to apply a. Angela, you're coming off mute, buddy. I'm gonna have to mute you again. The movement force itself, right? As an example, I want to add the force or multiply it by the force whenever I move to the right or to the left. And the way to do that is I need to hook into the rigid body. So the rigid body in Unity is here, but my script doesn't know about it. My script doesn't know that rigid body exists. It just knows that this is a game object. So I've got to inform it that I have a rigid body. And to do that, I got to do it with code. So back to this. I want to make a new, for now, let's make it public. We can make it private later. A new public of type rigid body, which we're going to call rigid body. Okay, so lowercase rigid body. Again, that's not enough. We need to associate it. This is just an empty or unassociated component. If I was to press save and go back to the editor, you're going to see that by default, Unity creates another little space for my rigid body, and it says none because there's no reference that's made to my rigid body. Now, typically in C#, I would have to say rigid body is equal to a new rigid body, and I could do that if I wanted to. But Unity does it for me, and the way to do that is to associate this rigid body, and there's 2 ways to get an association or a reference. One way is to literally just pull down a reference to my rigid body down in here like this. Watch. So left click and drag from my rigid body into this little space right here, like so. And now you can see that this rigid body object is associated with the rigid body that's connected to my player. Let's do it the other way though. I can also disassociate by pressing delete. In the space here that's where I see rigid body, I can press delete and disassociate it. So now it says none. By the way, the biggest problems we get whenever we have something like a null reference error is where I have no rigid body listed and I'm trying to access something that doesn't exist. Even if I have a rigid body that I've created, remember, it's just an object that I've created, a structure, if you will, right? But if I don't have an association or if I haven't done anything with it in code, then this points to nothing. It's just that empty pointer that points to the bit bucket in the sky. It doesn't point to anywhere at all. A random memory location right now is where it's pointing. I need to associate it with an actual object. So there's 2 ways. One, drag and drop, like I showed you. The other way is to actually do it in code. Let's do it in the code way. So I'm going to say rigid body, that's lowercase rigid body, is equal to get component of type rigid body. And I want to make rigid body like this way, okay, and semicolon. So what this does is it says, hey, hunt, I want you to search for a component in my game object that this script is attached to called rigid body. That's what I want you to do. And I want you to get a reference to it, a pointer. And I want you to store the reference here in this variable called rigid body. Let me say that again. So get component searches the game object that my script is attached to. It says, hey, take a look at the game object, find the first instance of rigid body, and make a reference to it inside of this variable called rigid body, lowercase r. Now that I've done this, if I run the code again, take a look. I haven't dragged and dropped anything, right? So in the editor, it shows none. But when I run it, during runtime now, it associates it right here. See that? It's associated with this rigid body. It did it at runtime, not design time. If I wanted it during design time, I could drag and drop from my rigid body into there. Then it would be done at design time. I'm doing it at runtime with the script. Okay. And we're going to do a lot of this dragging and dropping stuff where I associate one object with the other object, okay, when we do our scripts. And guys, we'll take a break soon. I'm just trying to get you guys going, right, with all this stuff first. And then we'll take a short break. So this is the first thing. So now that I have this rigid body, what I can do down in the update is I can add force to it. Let's do it. So I'll say, let's get rid of some of these debugs because I don't want the debug anymore. This is just for us to test with. All right, and let's do it. So I'll say rigid body dot add force. I want to add force. And it's asking, if you notice, for a vector 3. So X, Y, and Z component. It's telling me which direction do you want this force to go in? And how much do you want this force to be? Okay. Well, I could do a new anonymous vector 3 object and put in X and Y coordinates. Like, for example, to the right would be a 1.0f and 0.0f and 0.0f. That would be a 1 unit of force to the right, and I can multiply this, right, by my my movement force. And whatever that movement force will multiply itself by this vector. So example, if it's a value of 5, like I defaulted to, it's going to multiply 5 times 1, which means 5 units to the right, 5 times 0, 0, 5 times 0, 0. So this movement force scalar is going to multiply by the vector to give me a value so I can add force to the right. That's how it's going to work. But there's a convenience function that I can use, a static function that all vector 3s have. And instead of doing it this way, it's much more descriptive to do this. Vector 3 dot right. And if you hover over vector 3 dot right, it's a static method that returns a vector that's 1, 0, 0. So instead of me typing it in, it's a quick convenience way of doing it. And this is what I want you guys to do. A vector 3 right. Vector 3 dot right means a vector that is a brand new vector that's 1, 0, 0. Remember what a vector is? It's just linear algebra. It's just it's an object that has both magnitude and direction. And right now I'm giving it a magnitude of 1 and a direction to the right. Similarly, if I want to move to the left, I can take this and tap it in there, right? And instead of moving to the right, I can just change this convenient function so it says left. Again, I press the left button. So again, it's either the A key or the left arrow in this case. If I press the right button, it's the right key, right arrow key, or the D key, okay? And it's going to give input. I'm going to listen for my input. That's what input.getAxis does. And if it meets the criteria, it's going to add force to the rigid body that I've attached to the object, and it's going to move it either to the right or to the left. But you're going to see some issues. Let's take a look and see what the issues look like. So save, go back to Unity, let it compile, and then run. And when I do, it's going to fall. You're going to see it fall down. And then if I press the D key, you can see it skipping to the right. And if you press the A key, you're going to see it way to the left. So you can see that that movement is pretty fast. And now it's falling forever. Let's try that again. So run it, and you can see that I move it to the right a little bit. Just tap it, and you can see I'm going to get a little bit of motion to the left and a motion to the right. And this is not exactly what we want, guys. This is just me showing you that I can add motion left and right, and it's going to keep on skipping along in a friendly way, but in a random way, right? And by the way, if you want to see it in split screen, this is a great opportunity to do that. Let's pull our scene to the right of our game. So this is what my scene would look like. So here's live, right? So if I move to the right, you can see that what's happening here is I literally just roll over. I can roll over, or I can, the more force I put in, keeps going left and right. And why does this happen? Because it doesn't care If my object is, it doesn't care if my object is grounded. It's not checking for that. Anytime, it doesn't matter if it was on the ground or not, I can just keep moving to the left or the right. And that's what you're seeing right here when I press my A and D buttons. Not exactly what I was looking for, but we got input. Yay! Okay, guys, if you got input like me and it's ugly like this, I want you to press a check mark for in your, to test this out. If you didn't get any input and somehow it didn't work at all, X. Show me. So check mark if you're there, and I got one person that says no. So let me see if what I got here. I'm going to scroll down, and Sydney, talk to me. Why is it you have no input whatsoever? Did you finish your script, by the way, which is what I'm looking for? Trying to figure that out myself. Okay, so again, remember, the only way to get input is A, on the right in movement force. Take a look. This is the first part, Sydney. You must have a movement force of 5. If you don't have a movement force of 5, right, then then there's no movement force. And we're going to change this value. And then my rigid body should show none, but when I run it, right, it should be associated with the rigid body that's here. You can see the rigid body now is connected. Okay, in runtime. My script looks like so. It's not very complex. It's actually pretty ugly. And it looks like this. I've added a public float movement force here, rigid body, which I call rigid body. And this is my entire script right here. So you should have exactly what I have for the most part. Hey, this is a great place to put this up on GitHub so we can take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to do more scripting right with Unity. And this is the first time we're doing any kind of script. We're getting input. So hopefully this helps you out. We're adding force to an object. And I want you to think about it responding like something that has physics attached to it. When we add a rigid body in your mind, I want you to think about attaching physics. I'm applying physics to a component. If I don't add a rigid body, there's no physics to a component. For example, one thing to note is also that I'm just going to save this. My plane, my ground plane, still collides. Here's my ground plane, right? It still collides, but it doesn't fall because there's no rigid body attached to it. It's just a static object that's in my scene. Okay? Actually, one way you can think about this is it is rendering but not updating. Okay? It can do both, but right now it's not doing that. It's only doing one thing. Okay? And whereas my player is both rendering and I put a script on it so I can change its behavior, so it's updating. Great. Thanks, Sydney. Let's take a short break first, but before we do that, I'm going to say File, Save Project. I'm going to close down Unity. I'm going to go back to my Gitkraken. Let's go to Gitkraken here. Here it is. And let us push the changes. On the right, you can see it says 11 file changes in the working directory. Let's view those changes. We've added a player behavior script, a camera controller, and we've changed main. We've also added a green material and a tile prefab. We moved into the prefabs folder. These are all changes we made. Let's stage all the changes and go down here and said, added basic input, which is what we did to player cube. All right, that's all we've done. We've really just added basic input. We haven't really done much right now. We made changes to 11 files and then push. And that should push everything up to, you keep pressing the play button, Lushy. So you press the play button to start, and then play button again to stop. All right, so that should do it for you. All right, so now that we have everything up on GitHub, let's take a short break. Now, what I want you to do on the break, while we're taking a short break, is please take a look at my files and compare them to your files. If you want to start where I am, instead of you starting from the starter, let's start from where I am right now. And so what I'm going to do is up on eCentennial here, I'm going to go back to eCentennial and make an association with that particular file. So let's do that. So I'm going to go to eCentennial, and where it says GitHub repos, you have the starter, and now I'm going to have the lab 2 or lesson 2A repo. So let's do that. So I'll say create a new link. It'll be comp, or actually I'll just call it lesson 2A repo. All right, and for the link, let's go in, grab that from that link from GitHub. All right, so you should have that link. So if you're struggling and you're trying to compare your code to my code, it's right here. This is where I started from, and this is where I am right now. So you can always compare one thing to the other by clicking on these links and inspect them. You can even download this one and start from there right now if you're too slow or you join late. Okay. So for the people watching on YouTube, we're going to take 5 minutes right now because we don't have a lot of time today. So right now we're sitting on slide 22. I'm going to put a little message here that says back in 5 minutes. So on break, and we'll say back at, let's just call it, will be more than 5 minutes. Let's say 5:20. All right, back at 5:20 to give you guys a chance to take a washroom break, get some water, maybe a coffee if you have that in your house or wherever you are. And then we'll hook back at 5:20. And then we'll have about an hour and 10 minutes or so to finish off the rest. Okay, that's what I want to do today. I know there's a lot here, but I'm doing this because we need to kind of get going with scripting, and I got to talk about how Unity works. And this is part of what we're doing. This is the kind of a part 2 of the tour of Unity. All right, let's go on break, and we'll come back again exactly at 5:20. So I'm going to stop recording on YouTube now. All right, and I'll be right back.